Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali is a towering figure in Islamic intellectual history. Islamic law does not provide all the answers that I'm looking for. He started doubting not only the knowledge he acquired, he started doubting the sources of knowledge that he acquired as well. Al-Ghazali is often labeled as the one that kills Islamic philosophy. He undergoes a spiritual existential crisis, if you will.
Was he in his late 20s? I feel like that's when this starts to happen.
I
Spiritual existential crises.
Al-Ghazali is putting forth an ethical system of economic thought as well that could be very much beneficial not only for religious people, but also for non-religious people as well.
What happened to all the polymaths? All we have now is content creators. We just have podcasters. What happened to all the polymaths?
Ibn Rushd also a very towering figure. And he's saying that Al-Ghazali got things wrong.
Yeah,
right?
It's like a hip-hop diss track. Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on this series, we have Sami Al Daghistani, who is a professor and the author of Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali's Ethical Teachings, Economics of Happiness, which is a phrase I don't get to say often. Economics of Happiness. I love it. Sami, welcome to the series.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, let's start right there. Who is Abu Ghazali?
Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali is a towering figure in Islamic intellectual history. He was a widely read, widely respected scholar from the 12th century, 11th century. He passed away in 1111 from Tus, Khorasan, so that would be present-day Iran. And it is believed that he is one of the most prominent scholars in the whole of Islamic history. Now, he was a very, obviously, versatile scholar. He was trained as a jurist, and he studied with some of the best minds at the time, both in present-day Iran, but also in Baghdad. But also someone who really navigated multiple fields, from Islamic law and jurisprudence to philosophy, to theology, and to Sufism as well.
Okay, before we keep on going, I have some questions, okay? So he's born in the 11th century, okay? How does somebody become a scholar when they're born in modern day Iran in the 11th century? I mean, is he born into a academic family, an intellectual family? Does he get ushered into scholarship? How does somebody become a polymath? I mean, that idea, 1,000 years ago, how does somebody actually do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali and also his brother, Ahmed Al-Ghazali, they were, at least now looking sort of in retrospect, they were both prominent figures. Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali even more famous, even more widely recognized, I would say. But one way of acquiring that sort of degree, academic degree, is to have a particular scholars, teachers, and masters as well. And this is also what Al-Ghazali had, right? He was trained by a very famous figure in Islamic jurisprudence, Al-Juwayni. And then later on, he was sent from Iran, present day, to Khorasan, to Baghdad, to work at the very famous Nizamiya or Nizamiya Madrasa. And this was sort of a conglomerate, if you will, of madrasas that was established with the support of a very famous vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, hence also the name that connects the Nizamiya Madrasa. Now, his journey, though, does not end there. Once he comes to Baghdad, once he's employed by the Nizamiya Madrasa, and he teaches there for multiple years, he undergoes a spiritual existential crisis, if you will. And at least two different existential crises are noted.
Was he in his late 20s? I feel like that's when this starts to happen. Spiritual existential crises start around your late 20s.
He was somewhat older. And this is already when he sort of engaged with very important works in Islamic law and jurisprudence, but also philosophy and theology as well. And then he's gradually, if you will, drifting towards Sufism, or what we would call Islamic mysticism or tasawwuf in Arabic, right? And one of the crises is obviously connected to his profound doubt. So he started doubting not only the knowledge he acquired, he started doubting the sources of knowledge that he acquired as well, again, through various sciences. But also he started doubting his own sense perception, right? And he's saying that it's not enough for us to rely on our senses, even when we have to sort of interrogate the sources of knowledge, so the epistemology of what we know and how we know what we know, right? That eventually leads him to despair, and this despair eventually means that he left the prominent, prestigious Nizamiya Madrasa in his position. Allegedly, he was unable to speak, unable to communicate sort of his knowledge and his wisdom to his students. And this prompts him to leave Baghdad as well, under the pretext to conduct sort of the pilgrimage, Hajj journey to Mecca. This then opens up a whole new period and phase of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, where he's often regarded as a wandering Sufi, right? And this continues for over a decade. Now, one of the common misperceptions has been always that once al-Ghazali leaves his position in Baghdad, he has no connection to scholarship, he has no connection to the outside world, he's a wandering Sufi, right? But this would be incorrect, and historical sources point otherwise. Partially, this is indicated in his very famous intellectual autobiography, Deliverance from Error, or Mumkin min al-Dalal in Arabic. And also the fact that he was in contact with prominent figures, both political but also intellectual, right? So there is a trace of exchanges of letters that points to the fact that he was very much in contact with the outside world, while simultaneously also engaging in his most prominent work, one could say, the encyclopedic revival of religious sciences of Ihya Ulumuddin. So a massive composition of work which spans over 10 books, and each book has 10 different chapters. So encyclopedic work, which really can be regarded as an attempt to construct a whole epistemological ethical system through his revival of religious sciences.
So in this period, can you give us a little bit of sort of like the philosophical environment in which he was doing this work? Was it only built, did he feel as though he was referencing other colleagues and other thinkers at the time across empires and across century? Did he feel some sort of connection to earlier scholars from different places?
Yeah, so just to sort of provide more of a context, in what context really Al-Ghazali was brought up, and his sort of intellectual capacity really come to the surface, is definitely in Baghdad, right? He's someone who, as I already mentioned, trained by a famous jurist, and he goes, he studies, he devotes himself to the study of jurisprudence, fiqh and usul al-fiqh, as well as in Arabic. So what we will today call substantive law and then methodology of law as well, right, of the legal discourse. But he's dissatisfied with law, and he says law, let's just call it for the sake of simplicity, Sharia, and we can come back to that maybe on a later point, because this is a very complex term and way too often, I would say, erroneously equated with law or Islamic law, and this would be a great injustice, I think, to the concept of Sharia. But he's saying Islamic law does not provide all the answers that I'm looking for. And then he switches from theology or systematic theology, in Arabic, kalam, and he says, as important as theology is, it supports this idea of orthodoxy, right? And he says, I have to move forward. And then he's reading also other books from the field of philosophy, and he charges philosophers with an array of different charges. And he's saying even the philosophers, as important as they were, by trying to combine on one hand revelation, Quranic revelation, with logic, which is based on Greek tradition and heritage, they also got things wrong. So for him, the most sort of apt and sound way of obtaining knowledge and achieving, if you will, the hereafter is through Sufism or Islamic mysticism.
Okay. I want to go back to sort of setting the scene of what maybe the time actually looked and felt like, because obviously everyone's a product of their time and of their place. So what can you help paint a little bit of the picture of what Baghdad looked like, the Baghdad that he was writing in, from a power structure, from an economic structure, from a societal place, because so much of what he does is comment on how one should live their life, right? So tell me, how were people actually living their lives at that time? What was the structure like of the world he lived in?
Yeah. So on one hand, Baghdad has been sort of famous because of the Abbasid Empire as well, right? The Abbasid Empire starts in 750, and then you have the collapse of the empire in 1258. Now, this is often perceived as the quote-unquote the golden age of Islam, right? Which I think might be correct in some contexts, but is also incorrect in other contexts. What I mean by that is that, indeed, if you look from the perspective of the intellectual, literary, artistic, philosophical, scientific production that was sort of written or published in the Arabic language, then we can say that most works were produced in that period, right? Also by scholars who are not Arabs or Muslims, but they use the medium of Arabic through which they either produce their work or wrote their work as well. So immense, rich, dynamic environment. You've probably heard of the institution rather, or the movement rather than the institution of Beit al-Hikmah, right? The House of Wisdom as well.
Yeah.
So that translation movement, if you will, that really sparked some type of revolution of how to translate major, important Greek ideas into Arabic, and then further they were then translated also into Latin and other European languages eventually. On the other hand, you have the what we call also the formative periods in Islamic history. So by the 11th century, you have the formation of Islamic legal schools and legal discourse, right? You have the establishment of 4 major Sunni schools of law: the Hanbali, the Shanafi, the Maliki, and the Hanafi as well. So nonetheless, politically, we can say that this was not a calm period necessarily, right? Political leadership changes, different caliphs come and go as well. So you have a lot of different tension. You have a lot of different theological schools that pop up as well. And as much as this was a very productive, dynamic period when it comes to negotiating between different legal, philosophical, theological trends, there is also political tension, right? We have to look at not only what is happening in Baghdad necessarily, but also in the surrounding area, in the surrounding region as well. So very dynamic period, but it's I would say not just the intellectual trends, the influence Al-Ghazali, but also socio-political conditions, political trends as well. And you could even possibly interpret Al-Ghazali's decision to embark on a 10-year-long journey and to leave his prestigious position as potentially an implicit critique of the governmental officials at the time, right? So he's someone who is sort of aware, but also deeply dissatisfied with the political establishment of Baghdad at the time, right? And he's, for instance, charging the legal specialist as the ulama ad-dunya, so the scholars of this world, right? Scholars who they've forgotten about the hereafter. They've forgotten about the akhirah. What they're pursuing is sort of the lavishness of this worldly life, right? And the whole, if you want to, deduce one of the major aims of the revival of religious sciences, sort of his massive encyclopedic work, could be, as the title indicates, to revive some of the lost sciences already in the 12th century, right? And hence this sort of epistemological system that it's connected not only to the matters of the hereafter, if you will, but also very practically to how one should live, how one should eat, how one should sort of conduct oneself in relation to other members of society. to economic and financial transactions and so on and so forth. So it has both theoretical, if you will, epistemological, but also very practical, material implications.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the book and then we're going to continue. But can you explain what are ethical economics?
In this particular book that on Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, I do talk about his economics of happiness or ethical economics. In the other book that sort of comes after that, The Making of Islamic Economic Thought, there I much more introduce the idea of quote-unquote economic cosmology of Sharia.
Yeah. Let's start with the first book.
Yes. So ethical economics in the context specifically of Al-Ghazali, but also I would say Islamic intellectual history, means a theoretical, first and foremost, theoretical contributions by, let's say, an ethicist or a philosopher or a theologian or a Sufi or a legal scholar on anything that relates to economics or finances in a very, very simple terms, right? What does that exactly mean? Think of it as ethical contributions on how to theorize, how to put forth ideas, how to maybe create a theoretical system on economic thought or economic thinking, on economic ideas, that it's rooted within an ethical epistemology or an ethical framework. And where does this epistemology or ethical framework come from? Or for the majority of classical scholars, it comes from something called Sharia, right? And then we can again debate what exactly Sharia is. Is it based on the Quran? How much it differs from the Quran as well? But I'm looking more than just sort of being interested into the normative, prescriptive accounts by these scholars, and the majority of them do have a normative account. I'm much more interested about the epistemology, sort of the sources of knowledge when it comes to economic thinking and economic ideas in both pre-modern Islam or Islamic tradition, but also in contemporary settings.
Okay. So let's talk about this, one of his key ideas that he explores, which is this idea of like sa'ada, ultimate happiness. What does Ghazali say about essentially how to be happy and the pursuit of happiness, how it's connected to wealth, acquisition of wealth, purchasing, trade, work? What is the connection that he thinks is there?
Yeah, that's a good point to make. So broadly, happiness or sa'ada, if we equate sa'ada with felicity or happiness, is one of the ultimate aims of his epistemological system based on the notion of the hereafter, right? And he's actually very, very explicit about that in his Revival of Religious Sciences, whereby he says, and he uses, this is a technical term, he uses the phrase of ilm tariq al-akhirah, so the path of the science of the hereafter, right? Everyone should ideally strive to achieve or to be on the path of the science of the hereafter. How do we get there, right? And one of the sort of major roads, if you will, or directions leading there is through the very notion of sa'ada, right? Sa'ada provides or leads us, guides us towards that. Now, how does this relate to, again, both very ethical, theoretical, but also very pragmatic, material thinking and connotations? In brief, Al-Ghazali wouldn't necessarily differentiate, I think, the material transactions, if we talk specifically about economic and financial means, from broader theological, what we would call today probably religious or metaphysical ideas. So the very notion of ibadah, how one sort of performs oneself in a very religious way, would for Al-Ghazali and probably for other classical scholars be very much connected to transactions. So ibadat goes hand in hand with muamalat, right? Transactions and material side of things goes very much hand in hand with the ethical, metaphysical, and in some context that would be perceived as religious. This means that if one wants to properly conduct oneself, it's not only through what we would call religious devotion, right? To be detached from this world. It's actually the other way around. One's religious devotion should ideally be connected to all things material, all things social and economic as well. And this very much pertains to financial transaction, barter exchange, buying, selling, purchasing commodities, and so on and so forth, right? And then, if you will, we can go deeper into.
Yeah, can you give us like a clear example? I mean, this is like big picture, like, hey, listen, the way you conduct your life, the way you connect with other people, accumulation of material things. You would imagine somebody who cares about the divine would have some thoughts on this, that like materiality is maybe a problem when it comes to the pursuit of happiness. This is like very, very obvious, but what did he actually say about it?
So to give you very concrete examples, for instance, from this overarching ethical system, he would then come down and you would read few chapters within his revival, but also other books, whereby he would pause on what I would call on the acquisition of wealth, meaning anything that has to do with what we would nowadays call economics or financial transaction. Now that means, for instance, whether one should give zakat or not. In what capacity one should be able to give zakat, and how much would zakat be, and then how is that sort of linked to one's, again, devotion, right? Another example would be that prohibition of hoarding, right? Hoarding of food supplies, hoarding of medicine. Obviously, that would be prohibited. Why? Because food supplies and medicine is of such a vital importance to human beings that if one has an abundance of food or food supplies or medicine, one should be able to put that back into circulation, but not keep it for him or herself, right? A third example might be that one should engage in trade. So again, barter exchange, selling, buying, but not with a minor, not with someone who is blind, not with someone who is perceived as not being righteous and not having righteous character, right? Why? Because that all sorts of misuse might occur. All sorts of problems might arise with that as well. And then, and then on the flip side, how someone who is selling goods at the market, how that person should act, right? Again, in accordance with, broadly speaking, of course, within Sharia patterns, but this is very broad. Some scholars would try to explain that this is extremely rigid. It's religiously induced behavior and so on and so forth. Then other scholars actually are much more, I think, critical of that. And they say, well, first and foremost, Al-Ghazali is putting forth an ethical system of economic thought as well, that could be very much beneficial, not only for religious people, but also for non-religious people as well. And part of my project is not only to look into the Islamic theological legal discourses from a normative standpoint, but also from a non-normative standpoint. What do we do with applied ethics today in economic thought? Can we learn something from scholars such as Al-Ghazali, right? Who, again, goes all the way back to 12th century, and so on and so forth.
So here's a question for you, just to step out of the actual book for a second. If you were to explain why he is revered and thought of as one of the great philosophers, which of the following reasons would you give? And maybe a combination and maybe none of them. But is it because the clarity of his work is so overwhelmingly, is so pronounced? One, is it the clarity of his thinking? Two, is it because it represents a dramatic shift and he actually shaped the direction of philosophy after him and it's a clear pivot point? Three, is it that it's just the volume and almost the sort of the physical achievement of writing as much as he did? Or is it something else that I'm not taking into account?
Yeah. I would say it's all of the above, as well as other factors and features, right?
Okay.
In the sense that he's someone who was already, and this is very important, someone who was already canonized, if you will, in his own time, right? For
Oh,
other scholars,
he was a celebrity in the
so
moment.
he's already perceived as this sort of intellectual giant, if you will, at
A
the time.
Stephen Hawking type character of the
Of
moment.
sorts, right?
Yeah.
Second
Okay.
is absolutely the versatility of his thought, in the sense that it really spans various fields. And this goes for many other scholars at the time as well. They were polymaths for a reason, right? And polymath means that one would engage in Islamic theology and law, but also Arabic language and also sciences, for instance.
Yeah.
So,
What happened to all the polymaths? All we have now is content creators. We just have podcasters.
well,
What
I mean,
happened to all the polymaths?
today I think we're just, and this is, I mean, but this is a very important point, Mikey, because this has much to do with the modern division of sciences, and in the
Okay.
sense that we're specializing in one particular discipline, and then even further in one particular field as well, right? Which which can be seen as problematic as well. So, but Al-Ghazali is someone who navigates this very dynamic terrain from law to theology to Sufism. He produces also, very importantly, seminal books on the topic, right? Within philosophy, he produces Tahafut al-Falasifa, right? The incoherence of philosophers, if you will. And then on Sufism, again, he's a very unlikely Sufi. He uses both Sufi terminology, but also philosophical conceptualization, even though he critiques philosophers and he critiques theology and he critiques law as well, right? So I think we need maybe a different lens when it comes to Al-Ghazali to really decipher his work, right? That's
Yeah.
one. Second is because of the importance of the books that he produced. Third, of course, is the volume, as well, as you rightly pointed out. But then also, some scholars claim that he is the one that really influenced the further development of philosophy in Islamic tradition and Islamic history, right? And Al-Ghazali is often labeled as the one that kills Islamic philosophy. But again, this, I think, would be a stretch for various reasons. One, it's never simply one person or one figure per se that has this much capacity to kill, an entire field or an entire discipline. Second, even though he critiques or criticizes rather philosophy, it's not philosophy per se, but he's critical of the philosophers, of Muslim philosophers, right? Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, Ibn Sina as well. And as his book also indicates, is called Tahafut al-Falasifa, right? The incoherence of philosophers. Laysa Tahafut al-Falsafa, not philosophy per se as a science, right? And he charges them with unbelief. He charges them with the fact that they believe in the eternity of the world, and so on and so forth. And yet he actually uses some of the philosophical conceptualization in his own writings as well. And then, very importantly as well, if I may add, the direction of philosophy after Al-Ghazali and then after Ibn Rushd from 12th, 17th century as well changes. So we don't lose philosophy in Islamic tradition and Islamic history. It's simply the direction changes. Now we have actually the philosophy of light. We have much more production coming from what is today Iran, Persia as well, right? With Suhrawardi, with other scholars as well. We have later on Ibn Khaldun, 14th century as well, right? In Andalusia and so on and so forth. So the thought changes, the location, the locality changes, but not the discipline dies. I think this would be a historical incorrect statement.
Okay, going back into some of the stuff that he talks about, what did he say about wealth, accumulation of wealth?
In line with other classical scholars or ethicists as well. I don't think he differs from them so much. In a nutshell, wealth can be pursued, not just can be, but actually should be pursued. economic engagement is encouraged. Making
He's
profit.
talking on moral terms. He's talking on ethical terms, right? Or he's thinking exclusively in spiritual terms, or is there no difference for him?
I mean, ethical is, I would say, in his context, very much connected to the spiritual as well. So he's saying, yes, pursue wealth, pursue profit. I mean, profit would be allowed even as per religious sources, if you look into the Quran as well, right? So pursuing wealth is allowed, pursuing profit is allowed. The question is, as you pointed out, how do you do that? How do you pursue wealth? And then even more importantly, what do you do with it? What is the end goal of your pursuit of wealth or money in this regard? And I would say wealth might be actually more apt, because wealth might include property and all sorts of things as well, right? Not just money per se. So he's saying, go after wealth. Absolutely, go after money. You're actually encouraged to be an active member of society, right? You have to be not just this, again, this idea of wandering Sufi who is completely detached from this world. He's saying, no, one has to be very much active. And maybe his life points to the fact that after 10 years of being in Damascus and visiting Jerusalem and other places as well, he comes back. He comes back to his native Tus, right? And he's still engaging with teaching. He's still engaging with other political figures as well. So be an active member of society. What does this mean for wealth in particular? It's very important. How do you obtain wealth? Is it by what he would call righteous means or not? And then what do you do with it? Do you hoard wealth, or are you putting wealth back into circulation, which is one of the aims of wealth?
So,
right?
Yeah, so I like this idea because you talk about this, is the idea of like misuse of wealth, right? So how does that work with his critiques of materialism? So putting them back into society is one thing, but also accumulating objects and greed and extravagance and stuff like that. How does he make sense of those?
Yeah. So on one hand, engaging with wealth and money.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, being extremely cautious to strike sort of a balanced lifestyle, if you will. So one can have, according to Al-Ghazali, a little bit more than what is necessity, what is necessary. And we could possibly agree that, what is necessary is food, shelter, clothing, right? You can have more than that, but you have to be cognizant of what you have. And then the more you have, the more liable you become to society at large as well, right? And the more you have, the more you should ideally invest back into society as well, right? And he says that wealth is not only related to religious, theological aspects of life. I mean, that too, from a very orthodox standpoint, if you will, right? But also to all sorts of other ethical, material, social aspects of life. So you can help yourself. You can help your family. You can help your neighbors. You can help your community. You can invest, right, back into the community and so on and so forth. So the more money you have, the more liable you are to the community in which you live in. So extravagance would be something obviously negative, but so would be miserliness, right? So for Al-Ghazali, what is very important is to strike sort of the golden mean, a balance between what you have and what you could have in the future, but as long as you're also willing to share your happiness or your wealth.
Can I ask you a question? So like we're talking about consumerism and materialism and pursuit of wealth. People like me who are just pedestrians, people who consume the news and work in their jobs 9 to 5, who are not engaged in philosophy or analyzing philosophy, when they think about sort of the political economic spectrum, the two sort of sides are capitalism over on the right side, socialism or communism over on the left side, and it's like a single dimension, right? Within the context of how he's describing society and how he's thinking about how economy should be constructed and how people should think about ethical economics, does that continuum make sense? Or would he reject that entire that continuum? Obviously, he predates his stuff, but help me understand what he would think about that continuum, and if he would think about things on a different basis. What would he think about capitalism? What would he think about socialism?
Yeah. So, I mean, as you pointed out, he predates capitalism, he predates socialism. So I would say, on one hand, he would go against capitalism and he would go against socialism. Even though in some capacity, in some context, these pre-modern ideas could be connected to some specific instances and examples within socialism or within capitalism, right? You have scholars who claim that Islam produced an early form of capitalism. Why? Because the Quran actually engages engages with profit and money making. That with the fact that trade, I mean, early Muslim community was very much in favor of trade, right, and trading, very well versed in trade and so in commerce. But again, this would be, I think, a dangerous thesis and somewhat historically incorrect thesis as well, because you do have ethical standards and principles that I would say try to obstruct the unlimited acquisition of wealth.
Okay.
Right? In Islamic tradition as well. Or if you do obtain wealth, you would have to again engage with wealth by ethical standards and ethical means, right? So there is the notion of goodness, the notion of justice, the notion of righteousness. These principles, as a matter of fact, are important. They were important, right? On the other hand, you have other scholars such as Timur Quran who would say that Islam or Islamic tradition never developed an institution of corporation as well, which I think also is somewhat far-fetched. Again, also because it's based on this notion of the rigidity of Islamic law. And I think this thesis doesn't fully hold water because of the ethical principles. So on one hand, you can just look at what type of institutions existed in the pre-modern world or in the Islamic tradition, right? And you can come to zakat, right? The very notion of paying sort of alms tax, if you will. Now, zakat is different than income tax today, but it's both
For somebody who doesn't know, what's the difference between zakat and income tax, for example?
Well, I mean, zakat is it's based on a religious tradition first and foremost, right? It's one of the pillars of Islamic tradition as well. So it comes from a completely different context, right? Income tax is something we pay to the authorities, governmental authorities, states, and this is how states are being also in part funded, and then funding in turn social benefits, infrastructure, and so on and so forth, social life, if you will. But there's the difference between the two. Now, in addition to zakat, you have a religious endowment, or what is called in Arabic the institution of waqf, which is also very important because it funded a lot of the infrastructure in the pre-modern world, bridges and roads and madrasas, right, schools as well. And all of this obviously is very much shaken up and re-engineered during the colonial period, but it's extremely important in the pre-modern world. Now, I don't think it has the waqf or zakat. These concepts, these institutions, they do not play the same role as they did in the pre-modern world. Fast forward, and I will actually, in this context, I'm trying to answer your question. Fast forward to 20th century. You have Muslim scholars and Muslim economists, and most of them were trained as economists, which again is not unproblematic, and we can come to that maybe later on, who claim that Islam is very much compatible with capitalism, right? That there is no actually issue between Islam and capitalism as well. And this is a whole new discourse. To what extent Islamic economics and Islamic finance and Islamic banking really taps into the global market or not, right? And in what sense and in what capacity?
Who are some of these thinkers? So 20th century, there are Islamic scholars, economists who are saying that capitalism of the 20th century, based on Adam Smith's work, is compatible with Islam?
So Adam Smith is extremely important for our discussion, and I might pause on this a little bit. The common perception is that Adam Smith is sort of the father of capitalism, right? The Chicago School would very much say this is the figure of modern economics as well. But we shouldn't forget, and in my works, I'm trying to point to exactly this part. We shouldn't forget that Adam Smith was trained as a philosopher, as a moral philosopher, as a matter of fact, right? So a lot of the origins of economics, how we perceive economics today, is, in all honesty, philosophical in nature. Given the fact that Adam Smith was sort of critical of governmental interference or state interference, right, on one hand, but also very cognizant and aware of the ethical moral principles, I think he has something in common with the pre-modern Islamic world as well, and these figures, right? Then something in common with the Chicago School today, for instance, in 20th or 21st century. Now, so back to Islamic economics as a contemporary, as a modern sort of phenomenon. Initially, it started off as a third way economic system that would very much go against both socialism and capitalism. Right? So Muslim economists and Muslim scholars, they try to devise a new system that coincides with, again, the context is very important. If you look at the scholars, they come from the Middle East, but they come from South Asia as well. What is today, India and Pakistan, right? One of them is also very famously Maududi, a Muslim ideologue, if you will, who is very much in favor of, quote unquote, Islamizing the state institutions, the state apparatus, by saying we deserve not only our own state, that is an Islamic state, but it has to be accompanied by a functional economy. Now, on the ground, what started off as origins with Islamic economics or economic thought, few decades later, that eventually translates into Islamic banking and finance. And this is a very lucrative subfield, an offshoot, if you will, of Islamic economics that some might claim is much less theoretical, much more practical. But then I might add, its main aim is not whether we can surpass or bypass socialism and capitalism, but its main aim is how to make peace, if you will, with the global economic system. So in my view, Islamic finance and banking became incorporated into the global economy and functions as a niche within it, rather than, talking about the creation of a third way economic system that is completely detached from the global economy. I don't think we've achieved that. We as a society, and I'm not sure if this is one of their main aims to begin with.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to go back to one of my first questions about the connection to other philosophers. So I'm going to say a few names, and I want you to tell me what the connection is. So let's start with some of the quote unquote Western philosophers. So let's start with like Plato and Aristotle. What would he have thought of their work?
So Al-Ghazali engaged also with Aristotelian and Neoplatonic philosophy, but he would also critique. He would critique their philosophies, and he would go beyond it, if you will. When
he's talking about the incoherence of the philosophers, is he talking specifically about that group of philosophers?
He's criticizing or critiquing Muslim philosophers who are basing their reasoning on Aristotelian or Neoplatonic philosophy as well.
Yeah,
right.
It's like a hip hop diss track.
in some capacity. If you think of Al-Farabi or Al-Kindi as well, and other scholars from the classical tradition, and he would say they claim that they're Muslim, but they believe, for instance, in the fact that the world is eternal. right? And there are other, whether the Quran is created or not, right? And this obviously differentiates between the text of the Quran and God's speech and so on and so forth. But Al-Ghazali also is someone who says we have, and again, he uses philosophical conceptualization in his critique of the Muslim philosophers, right? But he's also basing his arguments and his ideas on the Islamic tradition, as do Muslim philosophers as well, right? But this wasn't sort of, Al-Ghazali was not satisfied with this type of thinking or approach, if you will.
So I'll give you another name who succeeds him, but like Ibn Rushd, Averroes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
what do you think was it? I mean, obviously he comes afterwards, but what is the connection between the two of them?
He comes after Al-Ghazali, obviously, and Ibn Rushd is someone who critiques in turn Al-Ghazali. And he's saying that Al-Ghazali got things wrong, especially in relation to philosophy as well, and what the Muslim philosophers' claims were, right? So, I mean, Ibn Rushd also a very towering figure. And he writes Tahawut al-Philosopher, right?
Yeah, another diss track.
Another diss track as well, back sort of in retrospect, if you will.
Yeah.
And then, some would claim that Ibn Rushd is successful in defending then philosophy in Islamic world, right? And just sort of as a side note, if you think of Al-Ghazali as well, but also Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and their Latin names, and this is primarily for scholars who do not work on the Middle East or Islamic world, their Latin names, I mean, this is quite telling, right? In the sense that you have Avicenna and Averroes, and you have Latin name for Ibn Tufayl and Al-Ghazali as well. It's quite telling in the sense that it shows the importance of these thinkers in the Muslim world as well as outside of the Muslim world, the impact they had on Europe, right? And humanism and Renaissance and scholasticism in Europe. But it also shows to a very Eurocentric reading of world history and Islamic history in particular, right? In the sense that what is in a name is very important. The fact that Ibn Sina is widely known as Avicenna and Ibn Rushd is widely known as Averroes is telling of the fact that we're not giving credit where credit is due, right? Using sort of original names is important. It indicates that these thinkers and these figures, they come from a particular milieu, from a particular context, right? From whether 10th or 11th or 12th century Andalusia or the Muslim world, right? So another misconception has been, at least until recently, that the Muslim philosophers and thinkers, they primarily translated the Greek tradition. They were translators of Plato and Aristotle. Nothing else. And again, this is a severely diminishing the active contributions of these thinkers and scholars and philosophers, that they actually were in conversation with the ancient Greek world, but also they produced their own works, right? The very notion, they produce their own concepts, like the very notion of hikmah or wisdom, which is its own, again, philosophical system that it's based both on the Quran, but also on philosophical reasoning. So they were not only translators, they were very much active contributors to the discipline.
How did this, maybe it sounds like a stupid question, especially after the loftiness of what we're talking about, but how did Ghazali pay his rent? It's not like he was going on book tours. How did he generate any sort of money? Yeah.
I mean, until his appointment as Nizamiya Madrasa, I mean, that was, that's relatively simply to answer. He was paid.
He had a salary, essentially.
Right?
Yeah.
And especially in a very prominent college in a very, very prominent city.
But for the 10 years that he was roaming around, working on.
So
how did he live?
You could look at his autobiography. You could look at his other texts as well. But I think it will be important maybe to look beyond the works of Al-Ghazali to see how other scholars got by, right? And Al-Ghazali was someone that, and I don't think it's very indicative only of Al-Ghazali, but he was someone that would spend quite a significant amount of time in the Umayyad mosque in Damascus, right? And he would sort of go there and write and be in partial seclusion as well. But again, he's someone also that engaged with society, maybe not in a specific period of time, but overall within these 10 years, absolutely, right? The historical sources actually speak to that. But very important notion on who is salarized and who is not. I mean, a lot of the legal profession in the pre-modern period, a lot of these sort of scholars or imams, if you will, they were not necessarily salarized. They were supported by not only by society, but they were supported by Waqf or governmental authority, if you will. They were provided with lodging, they were provided with food, they were provided with certain necessities as well, but not necessarily salarized. Salarization is something that comes later on, when a specific profession is created and then established as well. And this very much points to the relation between the establishment of a profession and the presence and the authority of a state.
Yeah. Okay, one last question before we wrap up, or one of the last questions is, and maybe this is sort of beyond the scope of your work. It's certainly beyond the scope of your work. What do you think Ghazali would say about today's global economy?
If we were able to sort of bring back Al-Ghazali, I mean, I think he would be very much disenchanted and with the global economy. I don't think that sort of he and his ilk would be in favor of, let's just call it what it is, neoliberal global capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Despite the fact that, again, just because you're allowed to make profit and you're allowed to make gains, you're allowed to engage with economic activity or financial transactions, doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely sort of hands-off, no ethical, no moral standards. It's survival of the fittest, right? This is not what classical, what I would call them ethicists, had in mind where they were producing this type of work, right? They were really talking about how something as particular as economic thought or economic engagement has to do with one's ethical positionality or ethical self, what I call it, right? So how much it has to do with your, not only your own sort of inner morals, but also with an ethical system that you're trying to follow. And, economists would probably disagree with me. They have been disagreeing with me as well, because I approach these subjects not as an economist, but someone who's doing work on Middle East and Islamic intellectual history, right? So my framework is actually different than an economist framework to these topics and subjects. And this is not to say that even capitalism is saying, but we have green economy and we have business ethics and we actually follow certain moral and ethical guidelines. Absolutely. But this is perhaps just the beginning of this discourse of what is valid as an ethical system within a global economic world, right? So, in brief, I think he would be very much dissatisfied, as would, an array of other scholars as well. And that's why you do have the I would say, constant contribution by Muslim and also non-Muslim scholars and thinkers and economists who are trying to rethink, but what is the well-being economics that we can achieve? Yeah. How can we actually go beyond the current infrastructure? But again, you cannot go against the economic system or the global economic system by not shaking up thoroughly the modern nation state and its foundations as well, right? I think the two are very much connected.
Yeah. Okay. Last question for you is, if somebody was interested in learning about Islamic economic theory and sort of philosophy, economic philosophy, who are the main figures that you would say you have to, like the top 5 figures that you're like, you have to read them in their voice?
I mean, from the classical period, I would say, of course, Al-Ghazali, Al-Isfahani writes also on economic thinking, Abdul Salam from the classical period as well, an array of scholars, Al-Mawardi, Al-Shaybani, so anything from really 8th to 14th century, Ibn Khaldun, very important as well, right, comes later on. That's from the classical period. From the contemporary modern, it's the field became so saturated that it's almost like difficult to distinguish between who are the Muslim economists or Islamic thinkers. They're trying to further this idea of Islamic economics and finance as a self-standing discipline. So you have one group of scholars who are writing on that. Then you have another group of scholars who are actually very critical of Islamic economics as a new field. And then you have third group of scholars.
That second group are Islamic thinkers who are critical of the idea of Islamic economics being its own separate field.
No, non-Muslim thinkers, non-Islamic thinkers, right? They come from sort of outside of the tradition. And then you have a third group of scholars who, I mean, they could be positioned sort of within the framework of Islamic studies or Islamic economics, who would be nonetheless critical of some of its conceptions and inceptions. And I would very much actually position myself in this camp as well, right? I'm not sort of taking at face value of what has been written and done in the name of Islamic economics and finance. I'm very critical of Islamic finance and banking as well. But I'm much more interested in the historical, conceptual, theoretical contributions, ethical contributions, right? And I think that as much as important as some concepts were, such as riba, right, prohibition of usury, or zakat, or the religious endowment, and so on and so forth, I don't think that the way they're being used today or presented as functional today is adequate. In other words, there's much more work for all these scholars actually to be to come forth and to be done in the future.
Okay. My very last question. Why does Ghazali matter in 2025? Why is he worth writing about?
I get this sort of all the time, right? What is it with a 12th century thinker that you're trying to sort of excavate or re-excavate, right?
Yeah.
And I would say I'm aware of the critique of Al-Ghazali as well. So I'm aware that even his writing in some capacity was for the elite, and he stated that himself. He didn't write necessarily for the common people, for Amma, right? Some books were, other books were not meant for the general public.
Very rare for a religious, spiritual scholar to be writing for the elite.
Well, was it? All right.
Well, was it? I guess that's just not how they like to brand themselves.
Well, and I mean, this is a valid critique as well. And second, how do you I think Zahra Ayubi wrote a wonderful book on Al-Ghazali and sort of the gender segment, the gender question as well, the issue of women as well, right? Which is valid, absolutely. But if we contextualize Al-Ghazali, I'm interested into what can we learn first and foremost from a different non-European, non-Western tradition on economic thought and ethics, first and foremost. And second, that just because somebody comes from 12th century, it doesn't mean that this is museum studies. This person cannot be incorporated. It has nothing to do with applied ethics. I think it very much, Al-Ghazali's theory and other scholars can be used for applied ethics in modern economic theory, in modern philosophy, and various other fields, right? 2025, we're still reading Aristotle. We're still reading Plato. Maybe not in masses, right? But these scholars are important. ethical theories are important. Philosophy is important, probably more than ever in 2025, exactly because of the individualistic life we live in
Yeah.
our sort of global, interconnected, but nonetheless neoliberal world.
Sami, thanks so much. Where can people find you, or if they want to reach out to you, where should they, or how should they connect?
Best way would be through my Lund University email, but also I'm available on LinkedIn. I'm available on academia, where most of my work is also sort of published and accessible as well.
Amazing. Thanks, Sami. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. And yes, I do want to congratulate you with doing such a wonderful work with this platform and podcast as well.